Welcome everyone to Living Without Anger. Comes from a discussion we had in the Race of a Lifetime, Chapter 4, The Good and the Beautiful Life. We had such a wonderful discussion. I wanted to take a few minutes to put together a short video of the key points of what we discussed. There was so much richness into it, it's going to be impossible to capture everything that we talked about. There are some of us that weren't there. Some of us wanted to go back over the drawing that ended up on a whiteboard. Again, this is going to be a poor attempt to recreate the discussion and the things that were brought out by everyone, but we're going to put many of the key thoughts that came out of that discussion in this video so that it might help remind us of what we talked about, be able to share with others. So let's get into living without anger. This is just a summation of all that we talked about and see where that gets us. So first of all, we started at anger. Instead of working on how we got to it, we started at anger. And the big question is, what is anger? And we struggled a little bit there, even trying to understand not how do we get angry or where does anger come from, but what does anger look like? And the easiest uh, explanation for anger that we understand is this out of control, this vehement yelling, screaming, cursing type of event that takes place in our life. And we really focus on, and when we talk about anger, that's what we look at. We see this is a description of anger. But it was also brought out that there is a type of anger that maybe is more Christian in its nature. It's the passive aggressive anger. It's the not blowing up, not saying anything bad. It's not saying anything at all. And in our discussion, we realized that both are very uh, caustic means of hurting somebody else. Be able to have a period of time in your life where someone allows the event for anger to take place in your life, and so you just quit talking to them. You cut them off. You don't say anything. You tell everything's fine, yet everybody knows that underneath the mask that you're seething with anger. And so looking at both of these, we had to understand that when we talk about anger, we're not talking about necessarily the events of raging that are taking place here on the right-hand side, but we're also talking about this passive-aggressive type anger. Both are wrong, and both types of behaviors are what we're looking to live without. And so the first point was for us to understand that. But if we set that at the bottom and saying that's not where we want to be, we want to then back up and we begin to discuss, okay, where does anger come from? And this is where our author does such a good job, Mr. Smith, James Bryan Smith, in the book. He talks about that the place anger comes from is really fear. That was hard for me to understand, and a lot of the guys to understand really what do you mean by fear? We're not, how am I afraid or fearful that's producing anger? And it was easily understood for us that anger is a defensive or reactionary uh, defensive emotion for us or behavior for us. We're defending ourselves. And so what are we defending ourselves from? We were defending ourselves from being hurt. And so it is a defensive reaction to avoid from being hurt. Being afraid of being hurt is why we get angry. It is fear that is a precursor to anger. We also saw in the book, in this, that there were those fins, what he called false imperative narratives. I'm alone. There's things always have to go the way I want them. Something terrible will happen if I make a mistake. I must be in control at all times. Life must be fair. I need to anticipate everything that will happen to me. I need to be perfect. This type of fear is the precursor to anger. So if fear is a defensive reaction to protect us from being hurt, from all the fins that we have set up in our life, the false narratives, then it makes sense that we have to look at and at these issues, what am I defending? And typically it's my kingdom. I'm protecting me, and I'm living within my own kingdom. I have to protect my kingdom as any good guard of my kingdom would be. And we look at the false narratives that direct the control of that kingdom, and we begin to have fear. When fear comes, anger is the next step. So when we move back up from anger, we see that there's fear, and that's very important for us to understand. Now, what he did say, though, and this is where our conversation really became, I think, rich last Wednesday, is that in the book, in chapter 4, he says we have unmet expectations. So fear plus unmet expectations as we go from the bottom up. So if you have unmet expectations, then you can, which we all do, and he talks about all the unmet expectations, waiting for people in a restaurant, all the times, traffic concerns, trying to be late, trying to get to to a meeting. All these things are unmet expectations. Those are the things that in chapter 4 says that cannot be controlled, and that you take the unmet expectations and you add them to fear, and that's where anger comes from. This is a combination. So we'll always have unmet expectations, but unmet expectations in and of themselves do not create anger. It's when they are combined with one of the fins, or it becomes defensive in the protecting of our kingdom, that anger comes about, which is true. Any unmet expectation we have, combined with fear, we have anger. However, what I would like to do, and what we talked about, is let's look at that from the top down now. Let's come back and look at that, because I think there's a piece missing. And as we had our discussion, it began to be very, very clear that we're missing a very key important, especially for Christians. What happens to us and where does anger come from? And maybe, as what Jesus said, the whole object of his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount was that our righteousness, he says in chapter 5, verse 20, for I say to you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. And what he was talking about is that the Pharisees were saying, well, I don't want to have any outbursts like the little guy down in the corner. I don't want to have passive aggressiveness. So if I can avoid those, then I'm good. Well, let's talk about, I think, behind the scenes a little bit deeper for us as Christians to exceed that of the Pharisees. Because I think unmet expectation provides something or produces something in us that we've never addressed, and it is this frustration, this aggravation that takes place when we have unmet expectations. Now, maybe there's no fear yet, but unmet expectations are something that resides in us, resides in our kingdom, sits with where we're at, and they produce for us frustration, daily, everyday type frustration. And it's the frustration piece that I want to focus on a little bit, and that we begin to look at and we begin to realize about frustration. There were a couple components about frustration. So you take unmet expectations, frustration, and fear, and anger. Now, that's beginning to make a little bit more sense, because we know each of us can address, maybe not necessarily that, but we can understand frustration. And we have the accumulative effect, or what I call the simmering aspect of our frustration. So what happens is somebody that we live with for a very long time, our children, our spouses, what happens in our life is there is a series of unmet expectations that we have in our kingdom, that they have in their kingdom. People we work with and worked with for a long time, we have expectations, and we get frustrated that they don't meet those expectations. But what we must realize is there is an accumulative effect, that we have not come down to the point, to the folks at the bottom where we have become angry, which is what I would define as boiling, a boiling frustration, where it becomes combined with fear, becomes a boiling frustration, which is the definition of anger. But what we have is a simmering effect that, like a pot of water, that I'm sitting there not quite at boil, but there's just this accumulative effect of frustrations that have built up. It's never back down uh, to point to a zero. I'm never, with the people who are closest in my life, I'm never at zero. I am just right below the boiling point. And so it takes very little frustration or for another unmet expectation to take place because of the cumulative effect for me to become frustrated and to express that frustration. What that means is that we have a lack of tolerance. Tolerance in this specific aspect of anger and frustration is that there's not fear involved per se, but that I have just become a lack of tolerance. And I shared it myself. I said, there are people that are in our group that I could sit down and work with on it, try to help you through a computer problem. I have full tolerance. I've never worked with you before, so I have really no unmet expectations. I really don't have any expectations for you. Therefore, I am very tolerant. You can be very patient if you want to use a good Christian word here, and I can work through a problem. Whereas on the other side, I have my wife who I have been married to for 40 years. I have expectations in the sense that I've already said this, or I've already done that, or I've taught that, or I've explained that, or you should know. See, these are all my kingdoms. These are my ideas. And so there is a cumulative effect of this simmering that I have a built up set of expectations around that. And so what happens is this is expressed in a lack of tolerance, a lack of patience, a lack of kindness and love in dealing with aspects. I already told you this. Why, you should have already known this, and it goes back and forth. And it is this accumulative effect or this lack of tolerance that takes place in our lives that we as Christians have never considered that this is a defensive reaction. Fear is not. We haven't moved down to anger. We're not screaming, hollering, cussing, or not counting. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen. I'm just saying if we're going to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees and we're going to move into the kingdom of God, what we really need to look at is our unmet expectations, the frustration, the accumulative effect of all of that, which produces for us, to the people who we are closest to, have been around the longest, a lack of tolerance. Now, what I would say is that this unmet expectation skips frustration, and these unmet expectations is what's producing this accumulative effect. This in turn creates the lack of tolerance and in turn produces the frustration. So however you look at it, and we talked about it in many different ways, and that was the richness of our conversation, we could all be able to see this, whether it's the rolling of our eyes, whether it's the manner in which we shake our head, and where we show these different pieces and how they happen so quickly for us. And if we are to live out what Christ wants us to live out, we have to begin looking at how can I reduce the accumulative effect of this simmering that's sitting there, this built up set of unmet expectations that are just sitting there. So it only takes one more, it's just, it doesn't take, one straw to break the camel's back. All these type of things. And we all could relate about how we get so frustrated so quickly with the people who we're supposed to love the most and are closest to and nearest to, that this is what's taking place. And that's what we have to look at. And not that we have all the answers, but we really have to sit and deal with getting rid of these unmet expectations, because as someone shared with me as I was leaving, this is all kingdom issue. Expectations, unmet expectations, are expectations that I expect to take place in my kingdom, how I want the world to run. It goes back down to the fins. My ideas of what this person should do or shouldn't do, and what is right and what is wrong. These are the expectations that we have, and these are what we are protecting, and this is what gets frustrated because my kingdom is not being run the way I want. And he made very clearly that what we need to do is take these expectations and place them in the kingdom of God. Because if we're going to trust God, if we're going to love God, we have to take our expectations from our kingdom, place them in there. And what we find is in the kingdom of God, those expectations really they are not in the kingdom of. There's not the expectations there. What does it really matter? What's going to happen in the long run? What in the view of eternity and the time that we're going to be in with the Lord in heaven for all eternity? What does He really matter? And so we filter our expectations, and that's how we get rid of them, is we begin to filter them from the kingdom of God, living within the kingdom of God. By doing that, we begin to remove the accumulative effect. We get rid of this lack of tolerance, and we're able to treat those who are closest to us with the same tolerance, the same patience, the same kindness, the same love that we share with people who are complete strangers to us. And it's this aspect of anger, living without this frustration, that I think that we need to address. So the whole goal of our conversation was to take anger, to exceed that of the righteousness of the Pharisees, as not looking at it as when I blow up and cuss, or when I go in and I don't talk and are there, but we simply move up anger to a higher level. And we begin, as Christians, we talk about anger like we talk about frustration, and replace frustration with anger. And if the idea is to get rid of anger, maybe what we need to do is to get rid of our frustrations and the simmering effects. I hope that makes sense to you. I encourage you to go back and read Matthew chapter 5 and Jesus' discussion on anger. But it begins to be a whole issue of exceeding the righteousness of the Pharisees, the type of life Christ wants us to have. And it is living not only without anger, but for us good Christian folks, let's try to live without frustration and the accumulative effect, the lack of tolerance that exists in our frustration, the rolling of the eyes, and those small things. Let's exceed that Pharisaical expectations that we have of ourselves, and we deal with them at expectations so that we can live peaceful, in love, in kindness, in tolerance with one another. God bless.